15 minutes. That is all the time that separated the greatest triumph of her recent career from the silence that would last forever. On September 26, 2022, Hillary Nelson stood on the precipice of the true summit of Manaslu. She wasn't just a climber. She was the captain of the North Face athlete team, a National Geographic Adventurer of the Year, and a mother of two who had skied lines that other mountaineers wouldn't even dare to climb with ropes. She had survived the Lhotse Couloir. She had survived Papsura. She had survived decades in the death zone. But at 11:30 a.m., amidst the thin air of the death zone, physics stopped caring about her resume. It wasn't a massive storm that killed her. It wasn't a catastrophic equipment failure or a lapse in judgment born of hypoxia. It was a patch of snow, a small slough, something she had skied over 10,000 times in her life. She clicked into her bindings, she took a breath, and she made a turn. And then she was gone. Her partner, Jim Morrison, watched the love of his life vanish into a 2,000-meter void in the span of a single heartbeat. The climbing world froze. This wasn't supposed to happen to Hillary Nelson. She was the one who always came back. She was the invincible mother. But on Manaslu, the mountain that so many climbers dismiss as easy or safe, compared to K2 or Annapurna, invincibility is a myth that gets shattered against the ice. This is not just the story of a fall. This is an autopsy of the precise moment where unmatched skill met unstoppable bad luck. It is an investigation into the chaotic season of Manaslu 2022, a season defined by record crowds, deadly avalanches, and a desperate race for the true summit that might have pushed climbers harder than they admitted. We are going to dissect the decisions made that morning, the desperate search that followed, and the brutal reality of recovering a body from a face that never stops moving. Before we descend into the details, if you believe these stories deserve to be told with the depth and respect the mainstream news leaves out, make sure you are subscribed. We investigate the disasters others ignore. To understand why Hillary Nelson's death shattered the mountaineering community so completely, you have to understand who was standing on that ridge. In the world of high-altitude ski mountaineering, there are participants and there are pioneers. Hillary was a pioneer. She wasn't chasing peaks for the sake of ticking a box. She was chasing lines. She looked at the 8,000-meter giants not just as things to climb, but as things to ski. This requires a level of proficiency that is almost terrifying. You have to climb the mountain, exhausting yourself in the death zone for days, and then, when your legs are trembling and your brain is starved of oxygen, you have to perform the most technical, high-consequence athletic movements of your life. A fall isn't a bruised hip. A fall is death. Hillary had normalized this danger. In 2018, she and Jim Morrison had done the impossible. They had skied the Lhotse Couloir. Lhotse is the fourth highest mountain in the world, connected to Everest. The Couloir is a steep, narrow chute of ice that drops thousands of feet. One mistake there means you tumble all the way to the western comb. They nailed it. It was perfect. It cemented them as the power couple of ski mountaineering. They were safe, they were calculated, and they were incredibly strong. That success created a narrative. Hillary and Jim don't make mistakes. They are the professionals. They are the ones who assess risk better than anyone else. So when they announced they were going to Manaslu in the post-monsoon season of 2022, it almost felt like a victory lap. Manaslu is technically an 8,000-meter peak, the 8th highest in the world, but in the climbing community it suffers from a reputation problem. It is often called a tourist peak. Commercial expeditions flock there to train clients for Everest. It doesn't have the technical rock climbing of K2 or the sheer terror of Nanga Parbat. For a skier of Hillary's caliber, Manaslu should have been straightforward. It was supposed to be a beautiful line, a clean descent, another jewel in the crown. But the mountain had changed. The Manaslu of 2022 was not the Manaslu of a decade prior. The true summit controversy had exploded. For years, climbers had stopped at a foresummit, thinking they had reached the top. But drone analysis and new investigations revealed that the actual, true summit was a precarious, knife-edge ridge further along. A ridge that required traversing a terrifying cornice with fatal drops on both sides. To claim a true ascent now, you couldn't just stop at the prayer flags where the tourists stopped. You had to go to the very end. You had to walk the razor's edge. This is where the story shifts from a standard expedition to a tragedy waiting to happen. Hillary and Jim weren't there to stop short. They were purists. They were going to the true summit, and they were going to ski from it. This meant they would be clicking into their skis on a piece of terrain smaller than a dining room table, surrounded by thousands of feet of empty air, while dozens of other climbers jostled for position on the ropes nearby. The margin for error wasn't zero. It was negative. On the morning of September 26th, the weather was aggressive. The monsoon hadn't fully let go of the Himalayas. The snowpack was deep, unconsolidated, and angry. Winds were whipping across the summit ridge, freezing exposed skin in seconds. Most climbers struggle just to put one foot in front of the other at 8,163 meters. Hillary and Jim were preparing to transition from climbing mode to ski mode, a process that is tedious at sea level and excruciating in the death zone. You have to take off your heavy mitts to manipulate buckles. You have to clear ice from your bindings. You have to balance on a slope that wants to throw you off, all while your lungs scream for air. Reports from that morning indicate the wind was gusting hard, blowing spindrift, fine, icy snow, across the face. Visibility was shifting in and out. It wasn't a bluebird day. It was a fighting day. But they had fought before. They had fought on Denali, they had fought on Cho Oyu. They knew how to handle this. They reached the true summit around 10:45 a.m. They didn't linger. The plan was precision. Summit, transition, drop in, survive. They spent about 15 to 20 minutes on the summit. Just enough time to realize the conditions were hostile. The snow wasn't the hard, edgeable neve they might have hoped for, nor was it stable powder. It was wind-affected, crusty in places, sugary in others. The worst kind of snow for steep skiing. It's the kind of snow that breaks unpredictably under your ski edge. But they were the best in the world. If anyone could manage bad snow, it was the team captain of the North Face. At approximately 11:30 a.m., they were ready. Jim dropped in first. He made a few careful turns, testing the slope, feeling the grip. He side-slipped a section, managing the slough, the loose snow that falls as you turn. He skied down and moved to a safe zone to watch Hillary. Hillary stood at the top. She tightened her boots. She checked her bindings. She looked down the line. It was steep, about 50 degrees. Steeper than a staircase. A fall here wouldn't stop. She pushed off. She made her first turn. It held. She initiated her second turn. And then the mountain moved. It wasn't an avalanche that swallowed the whole face. It was a small pocket of wind slab. A localized release. Under normal circumstances, on a ski hill in Colorado, this would knock you over, you'd slide 20 feet, laugh it off and get up. But on the summit pyramid of Manaslu, knocking you over means you lose your edge. Losing your edge means gravity takes over. And once gravity takes over on a 50-degree slope of ice and rock, there is no self-arrest. There is no stopping. Jim Morrison watched in horror. He saw the snow break. He saw Hillary lose her balance. He saw her fight for a fraction of a second to regain her edge, to drive the ski back into the snow. But the momentum was too violent. She was swept off her feet. She didn't tumble slowly. She accelerated instantly. She was carried down the south face, not the route they had climbed up, but the other side. The blind side. The side that drops 2,000 meters into oblivion. 1 minute, she was the master of her domain, the queen of ski mountaineering. The next minute, she was a small, dark shape falling through the clouds, disappearing into the gray void below. Jim screamed into the radio. He screamed her name into the wind. But the only answer was the howling gale and the sickening silence of an empty slope. The radio crackled at base camp. Hillary fell. 2 words that dismantled the world of everyone listening. But the horror was compounded by confusion, because at almost the exact same time, lower on the mountain, a massive avalanche had ripped through Camp 4. Dozens of climbers were buried. The radio waves were jammed with panic. People were screaming for help from Camp 4, screaming about broken limbs and buried Sherpas. And amidst that cacophony of disaster, the message about Hillary got lost in the noise. Was she part of the avalanche? Did she fall lower down? Or was she gone from the summit? For hours, nobody knew the truth. All they knew was that the king and queen of the Himalayas had gone up, and only the king was still on the radio. And he was sounding like a man who had just watched his entire life end. This wasn't just an accident. This was the beginning of a nightmare that would take days to resolve. And to understand how this happened, we have to look back at the partnership that brought them there, and the pressure to perform on a mountain that was deceiving everyone. //. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that ridge, you cannot look at Hillary Nelson as just another climber in a down suit. You have to look at the empty space she left behind. In a sport dominated by 20-year-old men with nothing to lose, Hillary was a 49-year-old mother of two who had everything to lose. She wasn't trying to prove she was tough. She had already proven that decades ago. She was trying to prove that life and adventure doesn't stop when you have a family or when you turn 40 or when the world tells you to slow down. She was the captain of the North Face Global Athlete Team. That isn't a title given out for marketing. It is a title given to the person who sets the standard for everyone else. She had built a career on surviving. In 2012, she became the first woman to climb both Everest and Lhotse in a single 24-hour push. That is a level of physiological endurance that borders on the superhuman. Most people are half dead after summiting Everest. Hillary came down, drank some water, and went immediately up the fourth highest mountain in the world. She didn't just survive the death zone, she thrived in it. She was comfortable in the thin air in a way that very few humans ever are. But the story of Manaslu isn't just about Hillary. It is about the partnership that defined the last chapter of her life. It is about Jim Morrison. In the tight-knit community of high-altitude mountaineers, Jim and Hillary were more than a couple. They were a singular unit. They moved together, thought together, and skied together. But Jim's presence on that mountain carries a weight of tragedy that makes the events of September 2022 almost unbearable to contemplate. Years before he met Hillary, Jim had lived through a nightmare that would have broken most men. In 2011, a small plane crash near Lake Tahoe killed his wife and his two young children. He lost his entire world in an instant. Climbing and skiing became his way of surviving that grief. The mountains were the only place that made sense when the rest of the world had shattered. When he and Hillary found each other, it wasn't just a romantic connection. It was a meeting of two souls who understood the fragility of life and the desperate need to live it fully while you have the chance. They were the perfect partnership. They were strong, they were cautious, and they were technically brilliant. Their defining moment, the moment that convinced the world they were untouchable, came in 2018. They traveled to Lhotse, the sister peak of Everest. Their goal wasn't just to climb it. It was to ski the Lhotse Couloir. This is one of the most aesthetic and terrifying lines on the planet. It is a narrow 50-degree chute of ice that drops directly from the summit area. If you catch an edge there, you die. If the snow sloughs too much, you die. If you are too tired from the climb to make a precise turn, you die. They nailed it. They skied the dream line perfectly. It was a masterclass in high-altitude ski mountaineering. It earned Hillary the National Geographic Adventurer of the Year award. It cemented their status as the king and queen of the big mountains. It also created a dangerous psychological trap. When you pull off the impossible safely, the improbable starts to look easy. When you ski Lhotse without a scratch, a mountain like Manaslu feels like a vacation. This mindset is the silent killer of the expert. It is not arrogance exactly. It is a recalibration of fear. Things that should terrify you stop being scary because you have done harder things before. By 2022, Hillary and Jim had a rhythm. They knew how to suffer together. They knew how to communicate without speaking. They had a system. They would go to Nepal in the post-monsoon season, September and October, when the snow is usually deep and skiable. They would climb without supplemental oxygen for as long as possible, moving fast to minimize exposure. Manaslu was the logical next step. It is the 8th highest mountain in the world, standing at 8,163 meters. In the hierarchy of the Himalayas, it is often viewed as the achievable 8000er. It doesn't have the bottleneck dangers of K2 or the technical rock bands of Everest. It is, essentially, a massive snow cone. For a skier, it is a paradise. A long, continuous ramp of snow dropping from the heavens. But there was a specific reason they chose Manaslu in 2022. It wasn't just to climb it. It was to settle a score with geography. For decades, climbers had been stopping at a point on the ridge that they thought was the summit. They would take their photos, claim their victory, and go home. But recent investigations by chroniclers like Eberhard Jagalski had proven that the summit was lower than the actual high point. The true summit was a terrifying, jagged rock tower at the end of a corniced ridge. Very few people had actually stood on the true apex. Hillary and Jim were purists. They didn't want the tourist summit. They wanted the real thing. And they wanted to be among the first to ski from the true summit. That distinction, skiing from the absolute highest millimeter of the mountain, was the driving force. It required them to push past the place where everyone else stopped. It required them to go out onto a precarious limb of snow that hung over a 2,000-meter drop. Their preparation was, as always, meticulous. They arrived in Nepal in early September. They acclimatized perfectly. They posted updates on social media showing them smiling, strong, and ready. There were no signs of weakness, no red flags in their fitness. They were two of the fittest 50-year-olds on the planet, moving with the efficiency of machines. But there was a variable they couldn't control: the weather. The 2022 monsoon season in Nepal was relentless. It refused to end. Instead of clear, crisp autumn days, the mountains were hammered with heavy, wet snow. Day after day, precipitation loaded the slopes. On a steep mountain, new snow is a loaded gun. It needs time to bond, to settle, to freeze onto the old ice. If it doesn't settle, it becomes a distinct layer. A slab sitting on top of a sliding surface waiting for a trigger. Most climbers look at snow and see beauty. Ski mountaineers look at snow and see mechanics. Cohesion, tension, sheer strength. Jim and Hillary knew the snowpack was sketchy. They spent weeks at base camp waiting for a window, watching the rain turn to snow up high. They knew the avalanche danger was elevated. But they also had a history of managing that risk. They believed they could outsmart the conditions. They could stick to the ridges, avoid the loaded pockets, and use their ski skills to manage the slough. There is a saying in the mountains: the expert is the one who knows exactly why he died. Hillary and Jim were experts. They knew the snow was dangerous, but they also knew that if they waited for perfect safety, they would never leave the tent. They calculated the odds just as they had on Lhotse, just as they had on Papsura. They decided the risk was acceptable. They didn't know that Manaslu had become a circus. While they were planning a precision strike, the mountain was being besieged by record crowds. Hundreds of climbers, hundreds of Sherpas, miles of fixed rope. The easy 8,000 had attracted the masses. This creates a false sense of security. When you see a line of ants marching up the hill, your primitive brain tells you it must be safe. If 300 people are doing it, it can't be deadly. But the mountain doesn't care about the crowd. Physics doesn't care about permits. As Hillary and Jim prepared for their final push, they were surrounded by an illusion of safety. A bustling highway of climbers pushing for the top. But up on that final ridge, where the rope ends and the void begins, the crowd disappears. It's just you, your partner, and the snow under your feet. They had the perfect partnership. They had the resume. They had the fitness. They had the love. They had everything required to survive Manaslu, except the one thing that no amount of training can buy. They didn't have luck. And on September 26th, the luck ran out. /////. To call Manaslu safe is the greatest lie in modern mountaineering. In 2022, that lie was sold to over 400 climbers who flocked to the mountain, creating a tent city at base camp that looked more like a music festival than a high-altitude expedition. The marketing pitch for Manaslu is seductive. It's an 8,000-meter peak that is accessible. You don't need the technical ice climbing skills of K2. You don't face the terrifying Khumbu icefall of Everest. You just walk. It's a long, steep walk, but it's a walk. This narrative is dangerous because it erases the mountain's teeth. Manaslu is essentially a giant funnel for snow. Its flanks are massive, open faces that catch every snowflake the monsoon drops. And in September 2022, the monsoon was dropping a lot. The weather patterns were erratic, dumping heavy, wet snow that refused to consolidate. The avalanche risk wasn't just considerable, it was extreme. But the industry of high-altitude tourism has a momentum that is hard to stop. Clients had paid tens of thousands of dollars. Sherpa teams had spent weeks fixing ropes. The pressure to summit was building like water behind a dam. Hillary and Jim existed outside of this commercial bubble, but they were forced to move through it. They watched as the mountain became a highway. The fixed ropes were a continuous line from base camp to Camp 4. On summit days, these ropes become bottlenecks. Climbers moving at a snail's pace, dependent on oxygen, can clog the route for hours. For ski mountaineers like Hillary and Jim, who rely on speed and rhythm, this is a nightmare. They had to navigate around the guided groups, trying to maintain their own pace without getting trapped in the conga line of death. But the real danger of Manaslu in 2022 wasn't the people. It was the geography of the new, true summit. For decades, commercial expeditions stopped at a 4 summit, a relatively spacious bump on the ridge where you could stand, take a photo, and turn around safely. It was comfortable. It was stable. But the true summit obsession had changed the game. The actual highest point of Manaslu is a sharp, rocky pinnacle at the end of a narrow, exposed ridge. To get there, you have to traverse a knife edge of snow that falls away thousands of feet on both sides. This traverse is terrifying. It is often corniced, meaning the snow hangs out over empty space, unsupported. If you step too far to the left or right, the ground literally breaks off beneath you. In 2022, to claim a valid summit, everyone was trying to reach this terrifying little point. And because Hillary and Jim were skiers, they didn't just want to touch it. They wanted to start their descent from it. The psychological trap was set. They were surrounded by hundreds of people, which normalized the danger. They were on a mountain with a reputation for being easy, and they were determined to do the route properly to the true summit. It was a perfect storm of false security. On the morning of September 26th, the weather window was tenuous. It was windy. Spindrift was raking the upper slopes. But it wasn't a no-go day. In the Himalayas, you rarely get perfect days. You get good enough days. For a team as experienced as Hillary and Jim, this was manageable. They left camp for pushing hard. They moved efficiently, passing slower teams, their focus narrowed to the task at hand. But as they climbed higher, the snow conditions began to reveal their true nature. The heavy snow from the previous week had been worked by the wind. Wind does strange things to snow. Packs it into hard slabs that sit on top of softer layers. It creates wind board, a surface that feels solid but is actually under immense tension, like a coiled spring. It also creates pockets of sugar snow, loose, granular crystals that offer no grip whatsoever. Hillary and Jim were experts at reading snow. They would have felt the changes under their boots. They would have noticed the hollow sound a slab makes when you step on it. But they were also in the death zone where judgment is clouded by hypoxia. The drive to the summit is a powerful drug. You tell yourself, it's just a short section. We can manage it. We've skied worse. They reached the summit ridge late in the morning. It was crowded, but they found their space. They pushed past the 4 summit, out onto the precarious traverse to the true apex. They stood on top of the world, 8,163 meters above the sea. They had done it. They had reached the true summit of the 8th highest mountain. But the summit is only halfway. For a climber, the descent is a relief. Gravity is on your side. For a skier, the descent is the crux. It is the moment of maximum danger. You are clicking into a mechanical device that amplifies speed and consequence. You are trusting a thin metal edge to hold your body weight on a 50-degree slope of unpredictable ice. As they transitioned from climbing to skiing, the reality of their position would have been stark. They were standing on a tiny island in the sky. To their left, the slope dropped away towards the standard route. To their right, the massive south face plunged 2,000 meters straight down. This face is a no-fall zone. It is a terrifying expanse of rock bands, ice cliffs, and hanging glaciers. If you fall here, you don't stop until you hit the bottom. They were in the safe mountains, surrounded by hundreds of tourists, about to do something incredibly dangerous. The contrast is jarring. While someone 50 meters away was being short-roped by a Sherpa to take a selfie, Hillary Nelson was preparing to ski the edge of oblivion. The crowds below had no idea what was happening above them. They saw two figures on the summit, two specks against the gray sky. They didn't know that the snow under those specks was a loaded weapon. They didn't know that the wind had built a trap specifically for a skier's turn. Hillary clicked into her bindings. The sound, that sharp snap of the boot engaging the ski, is usually the sound of freedom. It's the sound of the fun part beginning. But on Manaslu that day, it was the sound of the final countdown. She wasn't standing on safe ground. She was standing on a fractured puzzle piece that was just waiting for a nudge. She and Jim exchanged a look. Maybe a few words. Watch the slough. It looks punchy. The shorthand of partners who have survived everything. They didn't know that this was the last conversation they would ever have. They didn't know that the easy mountain was done playing nice. The trap was sprung. The snow was ready. And as Jim dropped in for his first turns, the mountain held its breath for one final second before exhaling chaos. ////////. At 11:30 a.m., time effectively stopped on the summit of Manaslu. The physics of skiing are brutal in their simplicity. You are fighting gravity with friction. On a 50-degree slope, gravity is winning. The only thing keeping you alive is the centimeter of steel edge on your ski biting into the snow. If that snow moves, the edge becomes useless. You become a passenger. Jim Morrison dropped in first. He was the test pilot. He made his turns cautiously, feeling the snow react. It was punchy, a term skiers use when the crust breaks unpredictably, grabbing your skis. He skied a short section, managing the debris that slid with him and pulled out to the side into a safe zone. He looked back up at Hillary. Hillary Nelson stood at the top of the line. She was small in stature but possessed a towering presence. In her bright North Face suit, she was a beacon of color against the white and gray. She adjusted her goggles. She checked her pole straps. These are rituals. They center you. She looked down at Jim. She saw his line. She saw the snow moving. She knew it was tricky. She pushed off. Her first turn was to the right. The ski bit. She held it. She transitioned weight, unweighting the skis to swing them around for the next turn. This is the moment of vulnerability. For a split second, you are floating. Then you drive the edges back down. She landed the second turn. And that was the fatal minute. As her weight came down on the snowpack, a small slab released. It wasn't a mountain-shattering avalanche. It was a slough. A surface layer of snow losing its bond with the layer below. On a gentler slope, this is manageable. You let it slide past you. Slough management is a basic skill for big mountain skiers. But on Manaslu, on that specific 50-degree pitch, the slough was heavy. It was dense. And it caught her. Jim watched through the lens of pure horror as the snow swept Hillary's skis out from under her. She didn't fall backward. She fell sideways and then forward. She was instantly accelerating. When a skier falls on a steep slope, they become a projectile. Skis, which are meant to control you, become anchors and levers, twisting your legs, catching on rocks, preventing you from self-arresting. She fought. Witnesses say she tried to self-arrest. She tried to dig her edges in. She tried to claw at the slope. But the snow was moving with her. It was a liquid conveyor belt carrying her toward the edge. The true summit ridge of Manaslu has a cruel geography. If you fall to the north, you might slide a few hundred feet and stop in the deep snow of the plateau. If you fall to the south, you disappear. Hillary fell to the south. Within 3 seconds, she was past the point of no return. She vanished over the lip of the ridge. Jim Morrison was screaming. Other climbers on the ridge, frozen in their tracks, watched the queen of their sport simply dissolve into the whiteout. One moment she was there, a vibrant force of nature. The next, there was only a track in the snow ending at a precipice. The fall was 2,000 meters. That is over 6,000 feet. It is a distance the human mind struggles to comprehend vertically. It is falling from the top of the Empire State Building 5 times over. It is a violent, chaotic tumble down a face of rock bands, ice cliffs, and seracs. There is no surviving it. The moment she went over that lip, Hillary Nelson was gone. But the mountain wasn't finished. Almost simultaneously, thousands of feet below, a different disaster was unfolding. Between Camp 3 and Camp 4, the massive accumulation of snow from the monsoon finally gave way. A huge avalanche released, sweeping through the route used by the commercial teams. It buried fixed ropes. It buried Sherpas. It buried clients. The radio traffic turned into a chaotic storm of panic. Avalanche! Avalanche below Camp 4. We have burials. Send help. Where is the probe team? In this mayhem, Jim Morrison's desperate call from the summit was just another voice in the scream. Hillary fell. She's gone down the south face. But the people at base camp were trying to coordinate a mass casualty rescue operation lower on the mountain. Information was garbled. Initial reports said Hillary had been caught in the avalanche. Others said she was missing near the summit. Some outlets reported she was safe. Some reported she was dead. The fog of war descended on Manaslu. Jim was alone on the summit ridge, paralyzed by the trauma of watching his partner die, knowing he had to descend the very route that had just killed her, but unable to go down the face she had fallen. He had to ski down the standard route, through the avalanche zone, through the chaos, carrying the heaviest burden a climber can bear. The knowledge that he was coming back alone. He skied down to Camp 4. The camp was a triage center. Injured climbers were being treated. Sherpas were digging for the missing. Amidst this scene of devastation, Jim had to explain that the disaster wasn't just here. It was 2,000 meters above them, on the other side of the mountain. And there was nobody to save. The fatal minute had passed. The physics had done their work. Hillary Nelson lay somewhere in the vast, inaccessible wilderness of the south face, far from the ropes, far from the rescue teams, far from the world that adored her. And Jim Morrison, the survivor, began the long, agonizing wait for a window to go and find her. The storm was closing in. The helicopter pilots couldn't fly. The search was impossible. For the next 48 hours, the world held its breath, clinging to the impossible hope that maybe she had stopped. Maybe she had arrested. Maybe she was huddled in a crevasse, waiting. But Jim knew. He had seen the fall. He knew that the woman who had defied death for 20 years had finally met a slope she couldn't ski. The easy mountain had claimed its toll. And the silence on the south face was deafening. ///////////. The chaos that engulfed Manaslu in the hours following Hillary's fall was absolute. It was a perfect illustration of how fragile the infrastructure of a commercial 8,000-meter peak really is. When things go right, it looks like a well-oiled machine. Fixed lines, stocked camps, hot tea. But when the mountain shrugs, the machine breaks instantly. Below the summit, the massive avalanche that struck the route between Camp 3 and Camp 4 had created a mass casualty event. An entire section of the fixed line, the lifeline for hundreds of climbers, had been swept away. Dozens of people were caught in the slide. Some were buried partially, some completely. Sherpas, the unsung heroes who hold the entire industry on their shoulders, were frantically digging out clients and colleagues with nothing but shovels and adrenaline. One Nepali guide, Annapurna, was killed in the avalanche. More than a dozen others were injured, some critically. The rescue helicopters were buzzing like angry hornets, trying to snatch the wounded off the mountain before the weather closed in. But helicopters have limits. They can't fly in a whiteout. They can't hover in 60-mile-per-hour winds. And they certainly can't scan a 2,000-meter vertical face on the wrong side of the mountain while dealing with a disaster on the main route. This split the focus of the rescue efforts. The priority, by necessity, was the living. The climbers moaning in pain at Camp 3 needed immediate evacuation. Hillary Nelson, missing on the remote south face, was a ghost story. Nobody could see her. Nobody could reach her. And in the brutal triage of high-altitude rescue, the missing are always second to the injured. This left Jim Morrison in a singular hell. He had descended to the camps, navigating through the aftermath of the avalanche, skiing past the debris and the blood in the snow. He arrived at base camp a shattered man. He wasn't just grieving. He was desperate to launch a search, but the weather was conspiring against him. The clouds had dropped a curtain over the mountain. No pilot could fly the reconnaissance mission needed to spot a single orange suit in a sea of white and gray. For 2 days the world waited. Rumors swirled. Social media, the double-edged sword of modern alpinism, was ablaze with misinformation. She's been found. She's alive. She's safe at Camp 4. The lack of confirmed information was torture for her family back in the United States. Her 2 young sons, her partner, her friends. They were clinging to the threads of hope spun by strangers on the internet. While Jim sat in a tent at base camp, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sky to clear. He knew the geography of the fall. He knew she had fallen down the south face, into the catchment of the Thalagi Glacier. This is a wild, unclimbed, and menacing part of the mountain. It isn't the trade route. There are no camps there. There are no trails. It is a vertical wilderness of hanging ice and rockfall. To search it on foot would be suicide. The only way was from the air. Finally, on the morning of September 28th, the window opened. The sky cleared. Jim Morrison, exhausted and hollowed out, climbed into an B-3 helicopter from Simrik Air. The pilot, Captain Surendra Paudel, is one of the best high-altitude rescue pilots in the world. He knows these mountains better than anyone. He knows the wind currents, the updrafts, and the limits of his machine. They took off from base camp and banked hard, flying away from the standard route, around the shoulder of the mountain to the south face. It was a landscape of terrifying beauty. Massive walls of ice, sheer rock faces, and the debris of 1,000 avalanches. They flew grid patterns, scanning the snow. Searching for a body from the air is incredibly difficult. A human being is tiny against the scale of an 8,000-meter peak. A bright down suit can look like a rock, or a shadow, or a trick of the light. Jim scanned the slopes. He knew she had fallen down. He traced the line from the summit ridge, following gravity's path. And then they saw it. It wasn't on the summit pyramid. It wasn't halfway down. It was near the bottom of the face, some 6,000 feet below where she had started. A small spot of color on the glacier. The helicopter hovered. Captain Paudel maneuvered the machine closer, fighting the thin air. Jim looked out the window. There was no doubt. It was Hillary. She was motionless. She was partially buried in snow debris, likely from the slide that took her or subsequent sloughs. The confirmation was devastating, but it was also a relief. The missing status is a special kind of torture. Found brings a finality that allows the grieving to begin. But finding her was only the first step. Recovering her was a different problem entirely. She was at roughly 6,000 meters, 19,600 feet. The terrain was steep and threatened by seracs from above. A helicopter cannot land there. There is no flat spot. To get her out, someone would have to be long-lined, dangled on a rope beneath the helicopter, dropped onto the slope, secure the body, and be lifted out. This is a high-risk operation. If the wind shifts, the rescuer slams into the mountain. If an avalanche releases, everyone dies. Captain Paudel made the call. It was possible, but it had to be fast. They returned to base camp to configure the helicopter for a long-line mission. Jim Morrison prepared to go back out. He wasn't going to let strangers do this. He was going to bring her home. The recovery mission launched. The helicopter returned to the spot. A rescuer was lowered on the line. He touched down on the snow next to Hillary. The rotor wash whipped the snow into a blinding cloud. He worked quickly, clipping the harness to her body. Jim watched from the helicopter, or perhaps from a staging area nearby, witnessing the final physical act of his partnership with Hillary. The cable went taut. The body of Hillary Nelson lifted off the snow. She swung gently beneath the machine as it turned away from the face that had killed her. It was a somber, surreal procession. The Queen of the Mountains, flying one last time, carried by the technology of rescue and the love of the man who refused to leave her behind. They brought her down to base camp. The noise of the rotors faded. The body was transferred. The chaotic tent city fell silent as the reality of who they had lost settled in. This wasn't just a climber. This was a legend. And she was gone. But as the helicopter flew her body toward Kathmandu, the questions began to rise like the clouds over Manaslu. Why did this happen? Was it just bad luck? Or was it the pressure of the true summit? Was it the crowds? Was it the decision to ski a slope that wasn't ready? The recovery was over. The investigation and the reckoning was just beginning. // The recovery of Hillary Nelson's body brought a physical end to the tragedy, but it opened a psychological wound in the climbing community that has yet to fully heal. When the helicopter touched down in Kathmandu and her body was transferred to the teaching hospital for autopsy, the finality of it struck hard. The media cycle moved on quickly, from missing to found to archive. But for those who knew her, and for those who study the mountains, the questions lingered. The autopsy confirmed what Jim already knew. The trauma from the 2,000-meter fall was catastrophic. She had likely died instantly or within seconds of the initial tumble. There was no suffering in the cold, no long wait for rescue. It was lights out. In a grim way, this is the mercy of the big mountains. They don't often leave survivors to freeze slowly when the fall is that big. But the why remained. Why did a skier of her caliber fall on a turn she could make in her sleep? The answer lies in the intersection of physics and probability. Ski mountaineering at 8,000 meters is a game of margins. When you are skiing a groomed run, your margin for error is huge. You can catch an edge, fall, and get up. When you are skiing the Lhotse Couloir or the Manaslu South Face, your margin is zero. But Hillary had lived in that zero-margin zone for decades. She had normalized it. The fatal factor was the snow. The slough that took her wasn't a monster avalanche. It was a small, localized failure of the snowpack. A slab maybe 6 inches deep, 20 feet wide. In the backcountry of Utah or Colorado, this is a manageable hazard. You anticipate it. You ski cut it. You let it pass. But at 8,000 meters, your reaction times are slowed by hypoxia. Your muscles are fatigued. Your balance is compromised by the bulky down suit, the oxygen mask, if used, the sheer exhaustion of the climb. And then there is the equipment. Skis are designed to plane on top of snow. When snow moves with you, you lose friction. You are effectively skiing on a moving treadmill that is tilting downhill. Once your center of gravity shifts past the point of recovery, physics takes over. Hillary didn't make a mistake in the traditional sense. She didn't turn the wrong way. She didn't cross her tips. She initiated a turn on a surface that disintegrated the moment she touched it. It was a trap set by the wind, the snow, and the geography of the ridge. But there is a deeper layer to this tragedy. The true summit pressure. For years, climbers had been content with the foresummit. It was safe. It was easy. But the climbing community, driven by record keepers and purists, had shifted the goalposts. If you haven't touched the true summit, you haven't climbed the mountain. This narrative pushed everyone, including Hillary and Jim, onto that dangerous knife-edge ridge. Did that pressure contribute to her death? Indirectly, yes. If the tourist summit was still accepted as the top, they would have stopped there. They would have transitioned on a wide, flat plateau. They would have skied down the standard route. They would be alive. But they were professionals. They were athletes. They couldn't stop short. They had to go to the point of maximum exposure because that was the new standard. The irony is bitter. Hillary Nelson spent her life pioneering new routes, pushing into the unknown. Yet she died on a trade route mountain, pushed into a corner by a redefining of what success looked like. She died doing the thing she loved, yes, but she died because the definition of that thing had become sharper, deadlier, and more unforgiving. Jim Morrison's role in the recovery cannot be overstated. In the world of climbing, it is common to leave bodies where they fall. It is dangerous, expensive, and often impossible to retrieve them. The death zone is littered with the remains of climbers who were loved, but who couldn't be brought home. Jim refused to let Hillary become one of those markers. He risked his life, and the lives of the rescue team to bring her back. That act, the recovery, is part of her legacy. It showed that even in the savage indifference of the high peaks, humanity can assert itself. We don't leave our own behind if we can help it. We fight for dignity even when the person is gone. In the weeks that followed, tributes poured in from around the world. The North Face, National Geographic, fellow climbers like Conrad Anker and Jimmy Chin. They spoke of her strength, her mentorship, her motherhood. They spoke of the Hillary factor, that intangible energy she brought to every expedition. She was the glue. She was the leader. But amidst the eulogies, there was a quiet reckoning happening in the ski mountaineering community. The realization that if it could happen to Hillary, it could happen to anyone. It shattered the illusion of control. We tell ourselves that experience keeps us safe. We tell ourselves that if we train hard enough, plan well enough, and make good decisions, we will come home. Hillary Nelson proved that wrong. You can do everything right, and the mountain can still decide it's your day. The safe mountain of Manaslu had revealed its true nature. It wasn't a tourist peak. It wasn't a walk-up. It was an 8,000-meter killer that had just taken the best of the best. And as the 2022 season closed, with the tents packed up and the climbers gone, the silence returned to the summit ridge. The wind scrubbed the tracks away. The snow filled in the void where she had fallen. But the mark she left on the sport, and the hole she left in the hearts of those who loved her, would never be filled in. / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / / avalanche. The legacy of Hillary Nelson is not defined by the 3 seconds it took her to fall. It is defined by the 49 years she spent rising. But her death forces us to confront the uncomfortable bargain at the heart of high-altitude mountaineering. How much risk is too much, and who gets to decide? In the aftermath of Manaslu 2022, the climbing world had to look in the mirror. The true summit obsession had been exposed as a lethal game of semantics. Is standing on a specific rock 3 meters higher than another rock worth dying for? For Hillary and Jim, the answer was yes, not because of the rock itself, but because of what it represented: integrity. Doing the job fully, not cutting corners. That integrity is what made her a legend, but it is also, tragically, what put her in the path of the avalanche. Her death also highlighted the gender gap in the perception of risk. When male climbers die, they are often hailed as warriors who died doing what they loved. When a mother dies, the questions are often sharper, crueler. Why was she there? What about her kids? Hillary faced these questions her entire career. She answered them by living fully, by showing her children that life is meant to be engaged with, not hidden from. She didn't want to be a reckless mother. She wanted to be an inspiring one, and by all accounts, she was. Her sons grew up seeing a woman who was strong, capable, and fiercely alive. But the pain of her loss is the price of that philosophy. The mountains don't care about your philosophy. They don't care about your kids. They are indifferent. And that indifference is what makes them beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Manaslu changed after 2022. The crowds are still there, yes. The commercial machine grinds on. But among the professional skiers and alpinists, there is a new wariness. The easy 8,000 is no longer underestimated. When skiers look at a slope now, they don't just see the line. They see Hillary. They see the slough. They see the fragility of the edge. Jim Morrison continues to climb and ski. He returned to the mountains because that is where he finds her. That is where he finds himself. But he climbs with a ghost now. Every turn is a memory. Every summit is shared with the partner who isn't there. His survival is a testament to resilience, but it is also a burden. He carries the story of what happened on that ridge. He is the witness to the fatal minute. The climbing community learned or relearned a brutal lesson. Gravity always wins eventually. You can cheat it for a decade. You can cheat it for a career, but you cannot cheat it forever. The goal is not to conquer the mountain. The goal is to visit the mountain and come home. Hillary Nelson visited the gods, and for a long time, they let her play in their garden. But on September 26, 2022, they kept her. Her body is home now in the United States. She is not lost on the glacier, but her spirit remains woven into the high peaks of the Himalaya. Whenever a woman straps on skis at 8,000 meters, Whenever a mother packs her duffel bag for an expedition, whenever a climber pushes past the easy stopping point to reach the true summit, Hillary is there. She taught us that we are capable of more than we think. She taught us that age is irrelevant to passion. But she also taught us the hardest lesson of all, that the line between triumph and tragedy is thinner than a ski edge, and it can disappear in a single breath. The mountains are still there. They are still white and cold and beautiful, and they are still waiting for the next dreamer, for the next pioneer, for the next mistake. If this story moved you, or if you learned something new about the reality of high-altitude skiing, please leave a comment below. What do you think about the true summit pressure? Was it worth the risk? Subscribe to the channel for more deep-dive investigations into the disasters that define mountaineering history. We don't just tell you what happened, we tell you why. Until next time, stay safe and respect the edge.